Hi, thanks for listening to the Lana Power Hour podcast. I'm Lana Power. This is episode 3, Building a Bridge Between Biochemistry and Human Experience. This is an episode with Dr. Ed Caddye. Dr. Ed is a traditional allopathic doctor who's done his full training in kind of traditional Western medicine, but is also now working in the decentralized medicine space in kind of health optimization medicine, looking more at fundamental principles underlying the symptoms of diseases rather than just treating the symptoms from the surface. So I got in touch with Ed because he's also a clinical researcher in the field of metabolic psychiatry and neuroscience, and we have a similar supervisor who's working in the field of breath work. And so we kind of got in touch talking about metabolic interventions and breath work potentially being in that space. And so we got together and we just had an incredibly fascinating conversation. He has so much to say and such a wealth of knowledge about decentralized medicine and really understanding the body and the physiology in paradigm shifting ways. So the intention with this episode was to really get into kind of the intersection and the bridge between the physiology and the human experience. So I'm kind of investigating in this field in terms of trauma and the stress response with mindfulness and breath work, but Dr. Ed has such a deep and wide approach to understanding these concepts in kind of molecular biology and really from a deep cellular and biochemical perspective. So he gives some kind of brilliant analogies for the way that I describe trauma and the stress response and the ability to adapt or either adapt or maladapt to certain stressors. And he kind of provides explanations for it on like a really deep cellular level. So it's fascinating. We also get into interoception and the role of the body. So the role of the things that are happening in our internal environment in terms of determining our perception and our awareness. And this is often talked about in terms of interoception of visceral organs. So being aware of our heart rate, our breathing, our gut. We also talk about this in terms of the awareness of our musculature and the posture of our body and the strength or weakness or tension in different muscles in our body, and how strength training or different forms of exercise and movement can actually work to improve interoceptive signals and predictions. If you don't know what that means, keep listening. This is going to be a fascinating episode. We also talk about the benefits of stress. So kind of about this idea of stress being a spectrum. On one side, stress that we can't cope with becomes maladaptive, but on the other side there's stresses that actually can allow the bodies to create adaptive responses and increase our capacity to really handle and deal with stress. So we get into some of those topics as well. We also talk about chronobiology and the role of internally regulated biological rhythms, and the evolutionary implication of some of these chronobiological rhythms that people in kind of the human optimization space are starting to really take a look at. So in terms of like getting sunlight in the morning, or also different like seasonal rhythms of the body and of the metabolism of the body. But I think these conversations really just get better the longer they get, the kind of deeper you dive into it. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your interest in science and physiology and the human experience. You can find Dr. Ed, I think his website's under, construction, but you can find him on Instagram at Dr. Ed Caddye. I'll put a link in the bottom. Thanks for listening. Okay, hi, Dr. Ed. How are you today?
I am very well, actually. I probably look a bit hot and sweaty. I've just done my movement for the day, which is something I always like to try and do before I speak to people. I saw you put a post up yesterday about getting ready for giving talks and things. Definitely helps to put yourself in your body so you can be a bit more present with the environment and the conversation. So yeah, I'm doing good. How are you?
Absolutely. Good. Well, hot and sweaty as well, so you are looking well. Yeah, no, I always find that like the like practical the tip that I've been doing before I have to kind of like be on is just I'm calling it like just like free movement in my body, just like doing the kind of like following like the weirdest impulses of like stretching certain places or like moving my spine and just like allowing my body to freely move as it wants to. I find that really like kind of shakes off a lot of like holding patterns of being stuck and helps me be present. So that's what I was doing 10 minutes ago. So cool. You and I came into contact through kind of a metabolic psychiatry intersection. And, the first conversation that we had, like the first conversation began about really just being a bridge and kind of working in this field where we're bridges between, in a simple way, kind of scientific worldview and more of a poetic, mystical, kind of phenomenological worldview, and really kind of working at this intersection of bridging mechanism and phenomenology. And I think that speaks in a lot of ways to kind of the work that you do and the path that you've been on from allopathic medicine, so training as an allopathic doctor, working in neuroscience research, and also now kind of being involved in decentralized medicine, and kind of more functional, like, holistic medicine. And so I just wondered if you could talk about like your path from being an allopathic medicine doctor into kind of decentralized medicine, and what decentralized medicine is and what you think the value is and what it has to offer.
Sure, yeah. I like that as a setup for the introduction. So going back all the way to the start, my mom is a nurse and my dad is an engineer. So in terms of a bridge, I was always very much a technician, but I had this nagging wanting to help and care for other people in the background, which initially was kind of suppressed, I think. And I went down the very hard science route, and studied biochemistry first. The University of Bath, ended up studying something called mTOR, which is this master regulator of cell growth that got me into understanding things like cancer. I got into it purely from a selfish perspective of wanting to understand nutrition and muscle building to see how big and strong I could be. And then went from studying the very depths of basic biochemistry to seeing that there were doctors working in the labs, but also when in clinics with their patients. And I thought that was a really nice way, again, to bridge two worlds where you can really start to answer questions that are being presented to you then and there by your patients, and not having to wait 20, 30 years for it to come out in the research, but actually you go ask those questions yourself. So after a year of doing a bit more of the caring side, I worked in special needs, working with kids with autism and kind of behavioral dysregulation, a lot of aggression, which was probably one of the most useful years actually of my education, was not being in formal education, but actually just working with people that struggled with behavior, into my 5 years of medicine. And throughout those 5 years, again, I kept up with my fairly esoteric interests, podcasts, holistic health, functional medicine, the newest cutting edge sides of medicine that just wasn't discussed in medical school. And bringing all of that biochemistry with me, I just saw how many gaps there were from my perspective of knowing all the basic cellular science, but it wasn't necessarily being applied for patients and improving patient care. So I found various groups on that journey. I had my own problem with back pain that developed in my 3rd year that I went down a very deep rabbit hole of trying to fix, which led me down a path of understanding movement and now into kind of neuroscience and the links between movement, trauma, physical pain, mental pain, emotional pain, with a perspective that I got from a new medical specialty that has started to emerge, founded by one of the smartest people to be alive currently, Dr. Ted Achikoso, who started Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, which is basically a framework for looking at health as opposed to looking at disease. And by combining these frameworks that I've kind of picked up from mentors and picked up from medicine, picked up in biochemistry, I've kind of weaved all of these things together to find myself as an academic in neuroscience studying lactate metabolism as it pertains to psychiatry and behavior and the brain. And then I work with clients who want to optimize their health, or ideally want to optimize their health, who are suffering with either physical, mental, or emotional distress most of the time, or they just want to optimize for longevity or a quality of life as opposed to a quantity of life, which the conventional medical system tends to focus on mostly. I think that's a fairly good summary of all of the different worlds I bridge at the moment, I'm open-minded to most concepts. I always like to try and keep one foot in the science, just so I don't go too far down the losing my connection to reality somewhat. But that's probably a longer conversation too. But yes, I can go off in all different directions from there if that
Yeah.
helps.
No, sure. I think being the bridge, I think you said it kind of speaks to having to have one foot in one world and the other, and having kind of practical experience in both worlds of understanding and deeply working with mechanisms, but also having the practical experience of working with human beings and subjective experience, because the mechanisms only really mean so much as they manifest into the subjective experience. The mechanisms of the body mean so much as they manifest into the subjective experience of being inside of a body. And so, like, really being that bridge is being able to kind of see both with a high fidelity, I think, to be able to see how mechanisms are influencing experience and how experience is in part regulated by mechanisms, but not get too stuck in one or the other. So yeah, I'm just curious if you could say a little bit about, like, just in terms of working with clients, like what is the difference for you as a practitioner in approaching someone from the perspective of allopathic medicine or disease-focused medicine versus having a client come in and approach their kind of health and their goals from a more like holistic world perspective?
Yeah, so in the conventional medical model, particularly in the UK, the patient will come to the doctor generally when they have an illness or a disease, or they have symptoms of an illness or a disease, hopefully. And that will lead the doctor to try and diagnose an illness or a disease. And in doing that, they basically put the patient into a box that says, you now follow this algorithm, which leads down this treatment pathway. So number one, you need to maybe give them this specific lifestyle advice. Number two, try this medication. Number three, if this medication doesn't work, try this one. If this one doesn't work, add this one, or take away this one, or try three of them at a time. And you have this list to go down. And then when you get to the end of the list and the patient is still struggling, there's not a next option. It's a sorry, this is the best that we can do.
Mm.
And that is fine in certain circumstances, but I'm very empathetic and compassionate, and I never like to leave somebody with the view that there's nothing more that we can do. So in my more decentralized approach, there's nobody telling me what I can and cannot do with my clients. So there's a relationship that's been built. There's a complete trust between us. And that trust is the patient will come to me, or I call them clients because my clients are optimizing their health. They're not sick, as opposed to patients who are looking more from the disease perspective. So I turn that perspective upside down. So we leave any diagnoses at the door, and we look at what does the body need from an evolutionary perspective, a foundational perspective to be healthy. How do we provide the energy to the body for it to do the things that it needs to do, and how do we balance the body to allow it to do those things with a level of homeostasis that is sustainable for the future. So it's a completely different framework. In the one-to-one and the client work, I am looking purely from a health perspective, and the first and foremost thing is the client and what their goal is, without any preconceived ideas from anybody else. And then in the conventional model, you're very much dictated to, unfortunately, just because of resource allocation and the way that the system is built. You try and pigeonhole people into a certain diagnosis, so then you can follow the algorithm to treat their symptoms. And when I work with a client, my goal is to detect and correct their imbalances, deficiencies, and subtle toxicities or weaknesses, and give the body what it needs to heal, as opposed to just treating the symptom and not actually getting to the root cause of what might be preventing optimal health.
Yeah, I it sounds to me like, just if you're looking at it from kind of a systems perspective, it's allopathic medicine is a top-down approach of looking at kind of the presentation of the symptoms as they appear, and then working backwards, oftentimes pharmacologically, to kind of patchwork the set of symptoms, versus a bottom-up approach, which is looking at kind of fundamental mechanisms of how the body functions optimally and kind of addressing the bottom-up mechanisms as they grow up into the manifestation of certain symptoms or manifestation of specific types of health and well-being. And so just in terms of like this approach of looking at fundamental mechanisms, I know you have done some work with metabolic psychiatry, and if you kind of take, fundamental mechanisms of the body down to a really kind of granular level, we're looking at cellular metabolism and the way that the body actually produces and processes its own energy, because that really determine the amount of energy that a system has can kind of determine its efficiency. And so I'm just curious if you have any insights about, in terms of the clients that you see or people that you come in with certain issues, how many of those people do you think are actually dealing with metabolic dysfunctions, and how much of the issues and the kind of symptoms that people are having issues with now are actually emergent from a really fundamental place of the metabolism, either both from kind of physiological health or psychiatric well-being?
Yeah. So again, to put things into context, health optimization medicine is the medical specialty that deals with the single cell, and that includes all of the organelles that go into it. And the key one that you're probably alluding to is the mitochondria, which is the population of what used to be kind of protobacteria that were engulfed into our human cells that produce energy efficiently for our system to work. And if you look into the work of Doug Wallace, who is essentially the researcher that has done the most work on mitochondria in the context of human disease. He basically shows that if you have 100% healthy mitochondria, you're very unlikely to have any disease. And then if you stepwise go down, maybe 90%, you might not see anything, but 70% you might start to get a disorder like type 2 diabetes or any number of our modern diseases. And you go down to 40%, you start to see things like dementia or significant mitochondrial disorders. And you can tie almost any of our modern diseases, high blood pressure, reproductive issues. There's so many, I can't even list them, but
Right.
there's a stepwise reduction in your capacity for these tissues to maintain energy balance, that they just simply don't have enough energy to heal. So when it comes to my clients, then yeah, it's understanding that, and it's actually why I got into this field in the first place, is there's many people that end up going to their GP or their doctor and saying, I'm just tired all of the time. And I was always interested to know whether that is something that can be measured, because they'll say, oh, the blood tests were all normal, you're okay. But their felt experience is that they're tired all the time. So what's missing? Where's the imbalance? Where are the deficiencies? Maybe they're not sleeping enough. But again, when you zoom all the way down to the cellular level, we do have these clock genes that control the circadian rhythms of our cells, but we also have the cell danger response, which is constantly analyzing the stress in our environment. And that can be physical, mechanical, emotional, whatever type of stress you want to throw at yourself. It will be experienced at the cellular level in exactly the same way. And whichever tissue or organ those mitochondria are that are experiencing that stress will dictate where your signs and symptoms or your issues will manifest. So if you have a stressed brain with poor mitochondria for a long time, you're probably going to develop a mood or a mental health disorder, or something like dementia if it's chronic and long term. And that's how you can kind of start to picture the importance of maintaining the health of our mitochondria in all of our organs and seeing our whole system as an ecosystem rather than this black box of inputs and outputs.
Yeah, I mean, I love to think about also the body as a system from the perspective of like systems theory and kind of making analogies in some ways to other systems. So like, for example, if you think about an economic system, like the energy production in a socioeconomic system. So the ability for us to produce, energy through oil or wind or gas actually determines kind of the ability for that system to grow and be efficient. And I think that's like, I love these fundamental principles that across systems that we can apply to the body. And it's the same case of like the ability for us to produce energy on a very simple level will be kind of the place that a lot of other either health or dysfunction emerges from. And so you mentioned something about the cell danger response. And so this touches on something I wanted to get to, which is really the relationship between um, like stress as an energy dependent process. And so the body's ability to respond to stress and adapt to stress as really kind of being emergent from the efficiency of the mitochondria, but also um, potentially the kind of bidirectional relationship by where the stress response that the body is in. So potentially if people are stuck in kind of chronic activation of certain stress responses, so chronic sympathetic activation or chronic parasympathetic activation, um, how that also will influence the efficiency of the mitochondria. So if you could just speak about this relationship between kind of metabolism and stress response.
Yeah, so we in health optimization medicine, we have this definition of health, which kind of makes things easy, which is A plus B plus C, which is A, absence of disease, which is kind of the conventional medicine's role. And then we have B, the balance of anabolic and catabolic processes, according to C, the life cycle of the individual. And it's this balance of anabolic and catabolic processes, which are basically determining the outcomes in the cell, and they are dependent themselves on the amount of energy that is available. So obviously, if there's an excess of energy available, you're going to be more anabolic. And if there's a lack of energy, there's going to be more catabolic or processes that break down. So if you look at the life cycle, children tend to be more anabolic because they're growing very quickly. And then as you get older, you become more catabolic and you start to lose life quickly and kind of approach an equilibrium with the environment, which is death and decay and all of those things. So the thing as a clinician, as a practitioner, I'm always looking at what am I balancing? And in the modern world, we tend to be more pro-inflammatory than anti-inflammatory. And actually inflammation is an anabolic process. So there's various metabolic pathways that we can then hang these ideas off. And there's various practical applications we can have with things like fasting or feeding or sleeping or when to eat, when not to eat, whether to take things like rapamycin or metformin or to take certain supplements that are going to shift the balance towards more anabolism or catabolism. And again, this is all in the context of the seasons, which is summer and winter. In summer, generally, you're more active. There's generally more inflammation. You're generally in more abundance. There's more food available. So you're having to deal with more food coming in from the environment, which is actually a stressor in itself. And in the winter, we have this more catabolic state where we are using our resources that we've built up during the summer and reflecting and coming to a new set point ready for the next growth phase. So it's accepting that we have these balances and phases in life. And there's work by this researcher called Robert Navio, who basically contextualizes the summer and the winter metabolism in cells at the single cell level. And there's basically a binary. He has a really good image in his 2013 paper that basically shows the same metabolites. So the chemicals in cells will be used for one pathway in the summer metabolism and a different outcome in the winter metabolism. And by understanding this in the context of stress and the context of where you currently are, whether you need to be more anabolic or more catabolic, you can then decide on the fates that your cells need to undergo in order to heal. And he defines this as a healing cycle or a salutogenesis cycle, which is a kind of a very new theme that's come out in his work in the last 5 years. And it's all coordinated by these metabolites in cells that control this cell danger response. So one
Right.
thing I would do with clients is I would measure all of these metabolites, see which ones are in excess, which ones are deficient, and then I would either through supplementation or very precise recommendations for lifestyle advice. It gives me a readout of these are potential reasons why you aren't able to overcome your current level of stress. These will help you start to heal from that stress, um, and become more resilient to stress. I think
Right.
that's a key point. A lot of people try and remove stresses and remove stresses and remove stresses. They reduce the foods that they eat. They would go very strict on like a carnivore diet for a long period of time, and they wouldn't be able to reintroduce these foods, fibers, and things that we probably need from an evolutionary perspective if we live in certain areas on the planet. Um, there's a reason for that, and it's just allowing the system to not see these things as overwhelmingly stressful.
Right. Yeah, I did want to ask you about kind of stress adaptation and like the idea of kind of a healthy adaptive system actually being one that's able to like adapt and respond to stressors, not just be kind of passively resilient to them, but really like incorporate and integrate them. But before that, you mentioned something about kind of seasonal cycles in kind of cellular metabolism. I'm just curious, is this something that's regulated by kind of a natural biological rhythm similar to the circadian rhythm, or is it something that's more regulated by light and kind of light sensing and temperature regulation? Or does the body actually have kind of a seasonal regulation inherently?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it comes back to the bottom up, top down concepts as well. I think there is probably, we've been around a good number of generations as humans. We probably have some intrinsic clock capacity in our seasons, in our days, in our months, but we can always increase the precision and the fidelity in the system by aligning ourselves more with the natural cycles. And yes, I think, I mean, the key, what they would call zeitgebers or time givers in biology would be light and heat, but also social cues and food cues are important there as well.
Yeah.
And they would all be things that I would address quite quickly with clients. Um, the the light story is a big part of the story that I think we're only scratching the surface in terms of, I mean, we're not even scratching the surface in allopathic medicine, but there's some very smart clinicians that are now talking quantum biology and chronobiology. And chronobiology would be one of the pillars that we have in health optimization medicine. I would use light therapy with myself and my clients. And probably the most practical thing that most people can do is making sure that they get outdoors fairly early in the morning and seeing natural light, which again, if it's winter, it's going to be cold as well. If it's summer, it's going to be a bit warmer. And again, it's just one way that your body is subconsciously reading these cues from the environment. You can leverage them as well. If you want to shift your rhythm, you can use things like cold plunges or saunas or deciding when and when not to eat. So yeah, there's all of these different inputs to the cell, and I think UV light is probably a big one. And I saw a really interesting post recently that suggested, because people ask this age-old question, do they need vitamin D in the winter? But it looks like melatonin, which is the hormone that's produced during the day but released at night, can also bind to the vitamin D receptor. So in winter, when you have high levels of melatonin, in theory, if you spend more time asleep and more time in darkness and more time in the cold, but in the modern world, we don't generally do those things. You have that higher amount of melatonin, which then can bind to the vitamin D receptor. In the absence of vitamin D production in the winter, then you can kind of create this natural balance to the pathways that should be active. Now, whether everybody can do that, potentially not. We live busy lives in a modern world, so maybe you do need to supplement vitamin D in certain cases, and that's where we would fall back to making sure you measure these things and having evolutionarily derived values to which you should probably have at least a minimum threshold for deciding to to do that kind of thing. And I hope I
Yeah.
answered your question. I forgot
No, you
what you
definitely did and asked many more.
asked.
I think I love finding these places in biology where I love to call it like the built-in biotechnology of like places where there's actually really intelligent systems that have been evolved to allow for adaptation between kind of the biological mechanisms in the environment. So like the melatonin actually being able to bind to vitamin D receptors, ideally when we're kind of living in a natural environment and having these cues that are in line with the natural rhythms, then the body actually has processes for creating adaptations. And that's where you get into this question of like the complexity of the kind of complex, modern social environment and like the ways that it's kind of detracted from our ability to be in a rhythm with the natural environments. And I've had these kind of questions myself about like, for example, with the circadian rhythm, like we can artificially uh, receive certain types of light at any time of the day now. And a lot of people are receiving kind of light that's throwing off their circadian rhythm, but also in terms of like this seasonal regulation with temperature and light, like so many people are living in kind of temperature controlled environments, or also people are traveling a lot more. So I think there's something interesting about your body kind of synthetically maybe potentially never experiencing summer. Like I know never experiencing winter. Like I know people who just are in the southern hemisphere and like summer chasing the summer, never experiencing the winter. Um, or another example is like people who live in environments that are really different from the kind of evolutionary environment of their ancestry. I've wondered this about kind of living in Texas and kind of coming back to England. My ancestry is English, and like feeling some sense of like belonging in this kind of like longitude, I suppose, and wondering if it's actually like a biological rhythm or something that is like kind of written into the way that my biological systems have evolved. And so when you just think about all of the variables and the complexity of how people are potentially have mechanisms to adapt to the environment, but are not supporting them, or not like living in a way which actually supports these organic processes in the body. And that now this is where we have all this research come in and all of these kind of human optimization movements towards kind of connecting us back into these evolutionary impulses and evolutionary kind of processes in the body. Um, so yeah, and I think a way you see this and that people are like um, developing practices around creating using the body's natural ability to create adaptations to stress. You see in like kind of the eustress conversation, so creating or like exposing yourself to certain types of stresses to allow adaptations to happen. So stressors that are actually healthy, and like hormetic processes, so intentionally exposing ourselves to stress to create adaptations. So would you just say a little bit about like the kind of difference, maybe from a cellular perspective, of like stressors that actually kind of overwhelm the system, or the body is maladapted to, versus stressors that are actually useful and adaptive for the body?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, but I'll try and give a good answer. While it's in my head as well, I have this analogy of the if you fracture or if you break a bone, then there's nothing inherently that you need to do other than put a cast on it to make sure it's in the right place and leave it. And then this natural wisdom of the body will heal it without you needing to take any medications or anything in particular. Now, there's ways that you can impair the healing of that bone, which is smoking, taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, for example, which we need the inflammatory response to heal the bone. So inflammation is not always bad, but the chronic inflammation may not be adaptive, to come back to the point. So I think anything in the context of a broken bone, you could argue that that stress was excessive, which is probably the case. The body could not handle it, so it broke. But the lesson was learnt and the body regenerated, and you came away probably with a cool story and a memory and a lesson and maybe you would call it a trauma as well. So that's how I see these things. You can see them as stresses that were too much at the time, but in the future they've become a lesson, or they were too much at the time and you still haven't almost been able to learn the lesson from that thing from a very psychological perspective. But I think the key is in being able to overcome the
Mm,
stressor, whatever that is. So let's say it's a stimulus that's not so significant as a bone fracture, but it's a virus that causes inflammation. Being able to experience the inflammation, having all of the resources available to deal with the inflammation, and reinforce that inflammatory response to do everything that's necessary, and then to come full circle. And when the body has inflammation, it's recruiting all of these immune cells, which will then remodel the tissue to allow it to rebuild. Then the rebuilding phase, and there'll be an anti-inflammatory phase, is important. Both sides, the bridge of these two sides. If there aren't these pathways that are reinforced, the anti-inflammatory, the ability to relax and regenerate and sleep and have enough nutrients available, have the right nutrients available, have the cofactors, the minerals, the micronutrients, or the social environment conducive to allow that healing cycle to complete, then you're going to get stuck. And it's going to be stuck in this cycle of usually chronic inflammation or a lack of anti-inflammatory mediators. So either too much inflammation or not enough inflammation, which will then leave you stuck in a cycle that can never complete itself. And again, go back to the cellulogenesis cycle that Robert Navio talks about. He has a really good image of this and how it relates to pretty much any disease that you can diagnose these days. And he puts them into different categories, ones that are stuck at different parts of the cycle. So it's coming back to the way I work is when I do test with clients from the metabolic point of view, it's being completely unbiased because I don't know what point in the cycle you're stuck. It might be that you're vitamin B6 deficient, which is preventing you from dealing with the neuroinflammation or producing enough of a particular neurotransmitter that is allowing the body to overcome this stress. And again, just for your listeners, you can induce a pretty good going B6 deficiency within a few days just by taking the oral contraceptive pill. So there's a lot of women that suddenly get very anxious or depressed after taking something like that. And it can be a case of they've sequestered all of the B6 that they need to do various processes in the body. One of them is deal with neuroinflammation, and it works with magnesium. And again, most people are magnesium deficient, so you can create a deficient state without knowing that that was the cause. So you would go back to being, oh, it was the pill that caused that, but really it was the deficiency in the context of the rest of their life and various other things. So yeah, it's understanding that you will always we're always going to have stresses coming in, and it's being able to deal with the stress and overcome it, have everything available to us. And I think it probably falls back all the way down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you need to, first place, you need to feel safe and be somewhere where you have safety and food and comfort and all of these things at the most basic level. And actually, the more I have worked with people from a somatic therapy perspective, in a lot of cases, the body has got so stressed by trying to heal itself, but never having these very basic, I'm safe, I'm secure, I don't need to worry that everybody's out to get me, I can trust people. If you lack those things, it's going to be really hard to recover anywhere, regardless of whether you're eating the right thing, doing the right thing in terms of ticking those boxes, because the nervous system, from my experience, always wins. And if it's deciding that it doesn't feel safe, then it's really hard for it to start to heal.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That explanation that you gave is really just a beautiful kind of physiological explanation for the way that I often explain kind of the processes of trauma, where actually the nervous system has processes for organically being able to respond to a stress and regulate itself back down and come back down to a place of kind of homeostasis and kind of to balance this autonomic seesaw in a really kind of healthy and adaptive way. But it's the points at which the stress response gets kind of chronically stuck or frozen, where the body is overwhelmed to the point of not being able to find that way to complete that cycle of finding its way back into regulation and homeostasis, that stress responses start to get stuck and become chronic. And really, we live in a world where there's a universal constant of like stress and danger. And so there's inevitably going to be encounters with danger, encounters with threats to our life, which can be incredibly complex in the kind of emotional and social dynamics that we live in, what we determine a threat to life to be, especially when we're talking kind of developmental and relational traumas. But it's really when the nervous system's unable to complete that organic cycle of returning to homeostasis, that things get stuck and where problems start to arise from that stuckness. And in saying that, it's also worth mentioning that there's ways to support that organic process from completing. So in the context of trauma, it's oftentimes like, do you have social connection? Do you have supportive relationships? Do you have like physical touch in your life? Are you laughing enough? Are you smiling enough? Or like, are you moving and dancing enough? And those really simple basic needs can be so protective against the stress response becoming chronically stuck. And it like just kind of comes back to how incredibly simple oftentimes a lot of maintaining kind of homeostasis and allostatic balance of being able to kind of respond to a changing environment that's often full of like stress and danger. um, Bringing it back to fundamental principles is actually quite simple, from the physiological and the kind of psychological perspective. Um, so yeah, the next thing I kind of wanted to ask you about was about your work with movement as medicine. So I know that you do some work with like kind of physical training and also like working with the musculature also, and how like kind of patterns of chronic tension in the muscles or weaknesses in the muscles and in the structure of the body can also be influencing the stress that people are holding on to, the subjective experience, like the emotional experience that people are having. So would you just say a little bit about what does that mean, movement as medicine?
Yeah. Um, so I guess I'll try and bridge it from our previous conversation. So from the metabolism side, I got very interested again through various mentors, one being Julian Pineau, the other one being Richard Aceves. Um, there was a conversation around lactate, and lactate is this fuel previously considered as a waste product of metabolism, but actually it's a really important fuel for mitochondria. And actually, when the stress levels increase, it's probably the most important fuel for the heart to pump and for the brain to work when you're stressed. And again, for useful knowledge, the heart at rest uses mostly fats for fuel, and the brain at rest uses probably mostly glucose, but can use ketones. And we can change the system by changing the type of foods that we eat and the type of diets that we would use, but that's another conversation. Anyway, the cool thing about lactate, and I wrote a paper about this, is lactate is a potential biomarker for stress, in that it can be produced in large amounts by the muscles, and it can travel quite quickly into the brain, and it's sensed in the brain in various ways, from a cell level all the way up to nuclei in the brain that include the locus ceruleus, which produces noradrenaline, the orexin neurons, which control behaviors relating to arousal, the RAF nuclei, and pH as well in the amygdala. So it basically orchestrates this experience of stress coming up from the body and putting that into context and giving the brain the raw material in terms of the energy to make of it what it wants to, based on how you're perceiving that stressful event. And there were studies done in the 40s and 50s that showed that in exercise stress testing, where they would put people on exercise bikes, for example, people with anxiety and panic disorder, PTSD, would produce much more lactate than people with, or who were healthy, in inverted commas. and they correlated that with a similar amount of lactate produced as those people with cardiovascular disease. So there was this kind of, these people that have problems with their physical health and these people that have problems with their mental health, in inverted commas, they both produce lactate in large quantities when they're stressed out. So I thought that was an interesting thing to research, which is what I'm researching now. But I got into movement. Again, I mentioned I had my own back pain and I wanted to understand why. And I think it makes sense to realize that humans, to feel safe, should be able to do basic human movements, which is walking for one, but ideally running, jumping, bending down to pick something up, and holding and carrying things over long distances, just because that's how, A, we would have got food when we were hunting gatherers, and B, that's how we would have escaped from a bear or from wolves or from another tribe. And I think if you look at it from that very simple view of, if you don't feel like you can run safely without injuring your knee or your hip or your foot, or I'm not sure if I can jump because I'm a bit scared, in the back of your subconscious mind, you're always going to be worried that the tribe is going to come and they're going to kill you and you're going to be the weak one and you're going to get picked off. So from a very fundamental perspective, we should be able to do most of these movements without worrying about doing these movements. And then you can look into the specifics of the muscles that are required. And again, if your hamstrings are very tight because you've been sitting down all day and compressing them, and they're not very good at lengthening under load, and they're not very good at rapidly contracting to propel you, then you can see how your body or your nervous system might slowly start to feel unsafe. And this all comes back to this idea of the free energy principle, if you're aware of Carl Friston's work, where the nervous system is predictive in nature. So we have a model of the world and we're always trying to gather data that reinforces the model that we've created. And the way that we either match our model or we update our model is through movement or changing our environment. So without movement, we can't gather more data, and therefore we can never update our nervous system to feel better, hopefully, or feel worse in some cases. So it really got me thinking about how important movement done properly and with safety is to allow the body and the nervous system to feel exactly that way, safe, which can dramatically improve somebody's ability to heal from, again, it doesn't matter where the suffering is coming from, can be physical, mental, or emotional. I've really become super passionate about movement just because, as compared to medicine, conventional medicine, where it takes a long time generally to see changes, I can take somebody who's 10, 15 years back pain and reduce it, I'd say more than 50% within an hour. In most cases, more than 90%. And people who think that they need surgery, they've actually gone as far as having surgery on one hip. And then they come and see me or a friend for the other hip, and then they don't need to have the surgery. And they're like, I wish I'd found you before I'd had the surgery on the first hip. So it's when you understand the blueprint of what the nervous system and the muscles are looking for in the present moment, you can almost start to like to think of it as almost neurosurgery or orthopedic surgery without a scalpel. I'm going at it through the software as opposed to through the hardware.
Yeah. So in terms of changing someone's experience of pain, is the work that you're doing kind of mechanistically updating an interoceptive prediction that someone has of their kind of muscular experience?
Yeah, so there's muscles that give us afferent signals, i.e. signals up to the brain, and there's muscles that are very efferent. So for example, I don't know if you've ever had musculoskeletal pain. Let's say it's shoulder pain. So you generally, you don't feel the pain in the belly of the muscle, in the pec or in the lats, but you would feel it in the joint or in the rotator cuff.
Mhm.
And again, people would present to their doctor or to a physio going, oh, my rotator cuff is really sore, or my shoulder joint is really sore. They never come to you saying, oh, I've got such like a sore chest. The muscle's really sore. No, it never happens that way. And actually, you give them a really sore chest through a properly guided workout where you push the intensity into the muscles, these big structural muscles, and the tension is moved away from the joint, it's moved away from the small rotator stabilizing muscles into these larger muscles. And if you can imagine, there's neural pathways that are then going, oh, we have these structural muscles, they seem to be working and firing. We don't now need to use the tiny little muscles, and we don't need to send you a signal up to the brain to say something's wrong. So it's, again, people will find my philosophy very backwards sometimes because they'll have an acute injury. And again, I've done this through experience, so it doesn't apply to everybody. They'll say, oh, I've been told to rest for 2 weeks. But in that 2 weeks, they basically are continuing to recycle that movement pattern that has created the pain, and they will chronically activate those pathways that makes it much harder for somebody like me to come in and almost reprogram before they've learned that painful pattern.
Right. It's like strengthening the prediction.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I will use high levels of stress through very safe movements to force the body to do what it's evolutionary supposed to do. And this will basically allow a liberation of energy that says, oh, we don't need to feel the pain anymore because there's no need to feel the pain anymore. What that looks like is uh, a workout, basically, a strength and conditioning workout, but I'm forcing the body to work and not allowing the person to either talk their way out of it or displace the tension, or tell me, oh no, I'm not sure I can do it. I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, which is why I have to be, if this is the difference between decentralized and centralized medicine, is if I did what I do with clients in a hospital, I'd probably get told off. But again, you've done somatic therapy and that kind of work sometimes. Uh, you will push somebody so hard physically that they'll break down and cry, and everybody looking on will be like, "Oh, that was mean of him." But then they'll cry and then they'll get up and hug me and say thanks so much. So it's
You're giving them the hormetic experience.
exactly. So I'm pushing them over that threshold of
Yeah.
they think it was the exercise that's going to fix the back pain or the shoulder pain, but it's not the exercise. It's the stress and the intensity of the sensation in the body that I'm going to force while doing the exercise, which will allow them to overcome what they previously believed. So I work with a lot of people who say, oh, I can only do 3 or 5 reps. And then 150 reps later, they'll be like, oh, I never thought I could do so many. And it's just purely the body has put this protective mechanism in place where it doesn't want to, again, face what it did in the past, or it assumes something bad is going to happen at rep number 7 or rep number 8,
Yeah.
whatever that means. It's arbitrary. But
It's
it's
an experience,
fascinating to watch.
experiential avoidance of the thing that's going to kind of cause a prediction error in what they've
Yes.
predicting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much richness in everything that you just said. And I think really a really fundamental piece for me is just this idea of like the evolutionary aspect of feeling unsafe in the body as being unsafe from restricted movements. And also like I think that speaks to this kind of in way that a lot of our kind of perceptual awareness and our emotional states and our conscious emotional states are in large part really the huge data set that's determining those states is coming from the information in the body. So it's
Yeah.
coming from the interoceptive information from the visceral organs, the skeletal muscles, the postural muscles, like the structure. So kind of speaking to this evolutionary nature of like having weak glutes or something, like having a flat ass makes you sad. I don't know, but like having like not having a sense of strength inside of the body or having an injury actually can be sending interoceptive information to the body that if not challenged can lend itself to the creation of a interoceptive prediction that we're weak or that we can't do something or that we actually cannot make adaptations to our environment.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I've spoke to you about this when I was when we met before, but um I always say that, like, I think in terms of my own personal healing work and overcoming a lot of, kind of developmental trauma that I've experienced, like the best thing I ever did for myself was start lifting weights. And that sounds like flippant in some ways, but like I really do think, and I think this is the case for a lot of women, especially, but like developing a kind of embodied experience of strength and capability inside of my body changed my mental health in ways that like I never would have predicted I never could have thought would happen, because all this information gained assigned to my body of like I'm capable, I can push, I do have the capacity to challenge and update my predictions of things. It starts to strengthen not only your kind of adaptive prediction, but just like strengthen your understanding and your embodiment of your capacity to go through that process.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is a really good point, actually. Sorry to interrupt you, but um, I always get asked the question, or do you think that going to the chiropractor or getting fascial work done or massage, or I think those things are better for what you said earlier in the conversation of having physical touch from somebody else, but it doesn't breed autonomy and a locus of control from the internal. So yes, you can release things, you can release certain tensions, you can release stresses, but you also have to be able to be resilient yourself to face their coming in the future, or they're there in the present moment. You otherwise you will find yourself going to a body worker twice a week to release over and over again the same thing, because you never are building the strength and the new movement patterns that allow you to move forwards. And a lot of these practices came from traditions in warriors, actually, where, for example, the Maori would come back, somebody would do all this fascial work on them to release the traumas that they'd seen, and then they would go out to the battlefield, or they would lift the weights, or they would be physically active again, and it would allow the body to almost overcome those things that they'd seen by instilling this sense of internal strength, which is exactly what you just said.
Yeah, I think this is what I've come to just through my kind of research and experience with it, is that the healing capacity in a lot of ways is actually in, like you said, the autonomy, the like developing the strength of the experience of autonomy. And really, it's the kind of self-generation of the prediction error, the self-generation of updating your model of how your body is and how your mental state is, that lends itself to an experience of resilience, where like I actually have the capacity to create this adaptation, to become resilient. And that speaks to the way that I teach on breathwork a lot of the times, that like the difference between the altered states of consciousness that you enter into on breathwork versus psychedelics is the internal locus of control of actually self-generating these experiences which allow you to update your models. That's so much more powerful than just being passive and allowing it to happen, I think, from a somatic perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the psychedelics are very interesting, and they are paving the way in terms of this research. But this is why Richard started his retreat called Movement Ayahuasca, which doesn't involve ayahuasca, but is a very intense experience that basically forces you to face your own behavioral patterns and cycles and doesn't let you escape them for 3 to 6 hours, depending on how long it takes you on one day, and then it's 4 days. This is all through breathing and movement. And the thing we like to tell people is you will only be able to push as hard as your nervous system is willing to push. So we're not going to force ourselves on you or anything like that. You will only be able to go as far as you're willing, or your subconscious is allowing, which again gives you that control and keeps the safety in the nervous system, which allows the system to gain confidence. The problem, and I speak through tentative experience in a country where it's legal, with psychedelics, when that sense of safety disappears, it's a real interesting experience go through. And whether that is also, I mean, it's a massive prediction error when that happens too. Whether or not that is a good thing in the long term, I don't know. I still haven't answered that question, but I think it probably is beneficial as long as everything is in place to be able to, again, overcome that stress of this is a terrifying experience. You're going to relive dying over and over again. And let's see how you feel about that out the other side, as an extreme example. But
Yeah,
yes,
I think there's something about the trust in the experience of maintaining agency and control, the trust in the body's organic processes that itself is healing. Because like it's not just that someone else is giving in or some other external agent is coming in to heal us, but it's the experience of, in order to really self-generate that process that like is allowing us to get to this place, requires a certain amount of trust in the organic healing process of the body. Or in the body's, it sounds a little woo-woo, like the body's organic healing process, but like the body's evolutionary function of maintaining homeostasis that sometimes just needs support to complete.
yeah, like
The
the cast on a broken bone.
Exactly. The trust in that itself just the subjective experience of that trust itself can be like huge.
Yeah, well, one of the on my journey through medical school, I was interested in chronic pain, because I had pain and also because I wanted to help people with pain. And I went to a chronic pain clinic and a patient asked the consultant, do they recommend going to, it was like a spiritual bath somewhere in India or Tibet or something like that to bathe in the water because they had heard it was good for physical pain. And actually, this was a really good consultant who said, yes, I definitely think that that would help you. And it's not necessarily that that specific place would help everybody, but it's the belief from that person. I like to call it the pilgrimage effect of the journey that they will go through to take themselves to that thing of water will be them overcoming it. There's a lot of autonomy there. Generally, if you go swimming and you have chronic pain, it will start to feel better. And that belief being reinforced by the observation of actually doing it, coming out the other side, being like, oh, I'm so glad I came here. My body feels much better. I can now see hope that we're moving forwards. I think is a big part of the journey. So yeah, the trust and the belief in the first place. Like I think that's why demystifying a lot of these mechanisms is these are the mechanisms that we're going to employ. These are the states and the steps you're going to go through in healing, and we can guide you through those. And in the end, you're going to hopefully feel like this, or you're definitely going to feel like this. I don't know whether you should say hopefully anymore. I like to be too confident sometimes, just to try and
Well,
really reinforce that.
I think sometimes it's easy for people to just kind of write something like that off as the placebo effect. And like the placebo effect is incredibly interesting from a mechanistic perspective. But I think that's an easy way of looking at it, of just saying, oh, well, the belief itself is just making it happen. And it's like, well, yeah, is that not incredibly interesting that just the belief in something can actually shift the physiology in that way? And so I really think that there's something much more complex and deep happening in terms of the way that experiences of subjective openness or belief or receptivity or awe can actually reorganize physiological processes in the body.
Yeah, there was a paper somebody was talking about that was fairly recently published where so ketamine is being used as an antidepressant recently, and it has almost acute effects, and it's an antidepressant within minutes to hours and lasts for days. But if you give somebody a general anesthetic and then give them the ketamine and wake them back up, they don't have the antidepressive effect. So it's not the ketamine acting on the receptors for ketamine that is having the antidepressive effect. It's the experience of receiving ketamine in a conscious state, knowing that it's going to be an antidepressant, going through the experience of the ketamine itself, knowing that you've had the ketamine and feeling it, and then you have the antidepressant effect. So it almost, yeah, prediction is reality, reality is prediction. All of these, we can call it placebo if we want, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
super
in
interesting.
what I'm hearing is that the kind of outcome is actually dependent upon the subjective experience in some way.
Yes.
And, and this is there's a paper on preprint right now, which I'm using to derive a lot of the kind of early indications for the PhD proposal I'm writing. But um, it's a paper about the mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms of how high ventilation breath work can lend itself to kind of increases in mood, decreases in depressive symptoms. And and the main finding of the paper is that, the decrease of carbon dioxide that you get to, so the experience of hypocapnia that you have from the chronic hyperventilation acts as like a kind of a gate. It's like an experiential gate into the altered state of consciousness, but it's really the the intensity of the subjective experience, the intensity of the altered state of consciousness that is predictive of someone's improvement in well-being. So it's not just, oh, you had decreased carbon dioxide for 45 minutes and then, and somehow that reorganized the physiology and your mood got better. But people who had like more intense experiences of awe or of kind of psychedelic experiences had greater improvements in their symptoms. So speaking to actually the outcome is, and they found this also with the inflammatory markers that they measured. So people who had more intense subjective experiences actually had greater changes in their anti-inflammatory markers and in their alpha amylase marker of sympathetic activity.
Mm.
So the subjective experience actually is predicting the physiological outcome, which
Yeah.
that
Well,
mechanism itself is
I'll
incredible.
take it one step further. And again, this is my thesis that I've no that I don't have good enough evidence for it yet, but I'm pretty sure it's the case is that the change in lactate in the relevant brain areas is the marker of the intensity of the subjective experience.
Mm.
So it's the thing that links the subjective to the metabolic and the perception of that and the encoding of the memory in the hippocampus.
Well,
Yeah.
will you say more about that?
Um, so I was trying to for in medicine, we would always measure lactate when somebody comes into hospital very sick. So they have sepsis or they have um, any level of sickness that requires to come in by ambulance, you're going to have your lactate measured. Generally, the higher the lactate is, the more seriously the A&E and the ICU staff are going to take it as this person is extremely sick.
So this is lactate in the blood.
Lactate in the blood. But obviously that lactate in the blood, as soon as it's over about 4 millimoles, is going to be signaling to the brain. And the intensity of that is probably signifying the intensity of the experience and how
Mm.
much the body is going to have to fight if it wants to survive. So they use serial lactates in ICU to show how likely somebody is to recover. The faster it comes down, the more likely they are to survive. They're overcoming this stress intensity, going back to our previous conversation. If the lactate's over a certain level and it doesn't reduce, generally that person isn't going to survive. And then there's certain contexts where, oh, I missed a step. So again, we know it activates these various areas in the brain and is itself produced downstream of norepinephrine, for example. So it's almost a top-down, bottom-up link between the brain and the body. But it also has an effect on the hippocampus and changes the epigenetics in the hippocampus to alter the metabolism, which I think is basically a fractal. So it's altering the epigenetics, which is basically changing the machinery and the metabolic machinery in the hippocampus, which itself is an area that is encoding memories based on stressful events. So if you have more lactate, it's going to perceive the event as more pertinent, and therefore it's going to have more lactate available for the hippocampus to undergo modification of epigenetic changes. In the context, again, of all of these neurotransmitters being elevated by an excess of lactate in the system. So it's almost signifying how much of a prediction error there is to the sense of self, as in a massive stress in the form of you're going to die, the lactate is going to be extremely high.
Wow. I had always, considered potentially it's the level of adrenaline or epinephrine that's kind of going to determine the intensity of the arousal in
So they're
terms of
directly correlated. So the concentration of adrenaline or adrenaline and lactate in the blood they follow exactly the same correlation in athletes. So they're probably all working
right.
together. I think at lower levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, you're producing more lactate if you are metabolically unhealthy or suffer from something like panic disorder or anxiety. There's like a more of a discrepancy there. I haven't fully worked that one out yet in my head, but there's definitely a link there on the challenge to the sense of self.
So are you measuring also for people's subjective experiences and like self-reports of subjective experiences in correlation with their levels of lactate?
I am not. It's a study somebody should do. I mean, there's nobody's put most of this stuff together yet, it seems, in terms of what it means, but there's papers that show, for example, public speaking raises lactate levels. And in the same journal, they will talk about how lactate is a measure of how likely you are to die from an illness. So it's linking very different forms of stresses together,
Mhm.
and acts on these areas of the brain that definitely are influencing our perception and our subjective experience of them. So yeah, I like to think of it as this metabolic, interoceptive stress metabolite.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned the influence that it has on the heart, and so potentially
Mm-hmm.
have on the interoceptive information that's being received by the heart and how that kind of shifts perceptual experience.
Yeah, so they did experiments in the 60s and 70s because they were trying to work out this link, and they would infuse people with lactate into the blood. And in people who had panic disorder, they would have panic attacks. And in some people who didn't, less, they would also have panic attacks. So again, it's a prediction error. When you suddenly give the body lactate, but there was no stimulus for that, and your heart starts beating quickly, that's essentially what a panic attack is. It's when, yeah, and again, one of the things I have been able to do through movement, very intense movement, is to show the body when the stress is this, then you'll produce this much lactate. So by creating these very intense experiences through muscular production of lactate, you can almost recalibrate the system to not respond the same way to endogenously stress-derived lactate, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. And you also mentioned potentially that there's an influence on the epigenetic shifts in the metabolism of the hippocampus. So potentially it's influencing the encoding and the consolidation of people's memories and like the landscape of their context, the
Mhm.
landscape, the context of their memories, because, you know, our affective states, our emotional states are kind of integrations of interoceptive information that's as it's contextualized in our memories in a way. And so potentially if the influence of the experience of stress on the consolidation of memory, it's all just shifting the kind of landscape of the perceptual experience through time in a
Yes.
interesting way.
So, Richard, my friend, and sorry, I got a cough now. He had a rock climbing accident. I think 2 years ago, he decided to go hike, not the same mountain, but one nearby in the same range, just to see how his body would respond. And again, he's like done a lot of this therapeutic work and um, worked on his body and his mind. And again, just walking onto the mountain and getting to a certain altitude, the you can see how complicated the encoding of these memories and integrated they become in that at a certain altitude on a mountain in an environment that previously was associated with being hit by a boulder and being trapped on a mountain for 14 hours before he was found to then survive. Um, he started to like dissociate, and his heart rate was like 180 plus for a good amount of time. And you could argue that that was bad, but again, it's a form of exposure therapy. So he went up the mountain, he came back down, he survived. It's now 2 years later. nothing bad has happened. So his the context around that environment and that experience can now be almost downgraded of, oh no, it doesn't mean that we're gonna be hit by a boulder every time we go back on the mountain.
Yeah, and to kind of encounter the stressful experience, or to encounter the challenge and the difficulty emotionally and physiologically of that, and to not avoid it until it's have the experiential exposure to that experience, kind of allows the system to create a new memory around that association that like liberates some of the over association of like threat to life, danger, death, and all of the kind of contextual aspects of that perceptual experience.
Yeah.
I said we are going to do 30 minutes and you were right. It was impossible. Um, so the last question I wanted to ask, just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, is if you have practical tools. So I know you're an incredibly efficient, busy man who wears many hats. So I'm just curious if you have any like practical tools or tips incorporating all of these topics we've talked about in terms of metabolism and movement that you practice on a daily basis to kind of stay adaptive to stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets said a lot, but I will say again, a consistent sleep time is amazing, because if you don't get good sleep, you cannot clear lactate for one, but various things from your brain, which is going to feed into the next day. So if you feel stressed on one day and you don't sleep well, you're going to feel more stressed the next day. If you really want to get on top of being able to start these healing cycles, then making sure that you have a good night's sleep. And the best way to do that is to prioritize a sleep time as opposed to a wake up time, because then your first activity of your day is sleep as opposed to waking up.
Mm.
But some people, they over focus on the sleep, which generally means they probably aren't doing enough in the day, which is physical activity. So that would be my second one, is physical activity from a range of stress. So a 10 out of 10 level of stress, and a 1 out of 10 or a 0 out of 10. So a 0 out of 10 would be meditation, sitting doing nothing, and a 10 out of 10 would be the hardest workout that you've ever done before, which you may never have even experienced a 10 out of 10. You think that your 6 out of 10 daily life is a 10 out of 10. Can I give you an example? Oh yeah. So put on a song. Let's go Daft Punk Around the World. So it's about 7 minutes. Every time you hear the word world, you're going to do a glute bridge. So you're going to hold in a glute bridge at the top, squeezing your glutes for the whole 7 minutes. Every time you hear the word world, you're going to go down and back up. You'll go through a roller coaster of emotions through the whole 7 minutes. But work out when you're quitting or when you're failing.
Mm. And the difference being
The difference being you can always push past the stress, but you're choosing not to.
get some water. Maybe this is our cue. Well, I'll just say I love that your practical tips are actually really fundamental and simple, and not like, oh, well, you need this supplement and this light and all this technology and stuff, but sleep and movement, evolutionary simplicity.
Yeah. And the other one would be, every time you have a meal, just go walk for 10 minutes.
Mm.
It's going to suppress some of the inflammatory response to the meal. It's going to get some blood flow and movement away from the stomach, or to the stomach, depending on what kind of problems you might be experiencing. And ideally do it outside. So if you're an indoor worker, it's going to prompt you to have a 10-minute walk after you've eaten. Ideally, have your meal outside as well and get
It
some
has
sun.
some influence on glucose metabolism and the way that we kind of process glucose if we're having 10 minutes of movement after a meal.
Exactly. And even so, there's a recent paper that shows that red light, so the red and infrared frequencies of light from the sun, lower your glucose response to a meal, even in diabetics. So eating indoors will have higher blood sugar responses than eating outdoors.
Amazing.
Yeah.
One last question. I'm curious
Yeah.
if you have opinions about sleep time, because I've heard some people say that kind of the first phase of, phase three, slow, what is it? Slow wave sleep, phase three of non-REM sleep is like if it happens before a certain time, so it happens before midnight, potentially there's a greater kind of flush of the brain, and there's kind of a pump and a kind of a cleansing of the brain and a release of kind of like growth factors that only happen if you get that, third phase of non-REM sleep before a certain time. Do you know anything about this?
I think I've heard bits and bobs about that. I think from a very practical perspective, I think consistency is much more effective than trying to fit to a routine that isn't sustainable. So as we talked about before, the body is good at finding these cycles for itself. So if you find a rhythm and routine that works for you, ideally that is 8 hours or 7.5 to 8.5 hours sleep, ideally, or 6 hours plus a nap, maybe during your day if you really have to, but ideally a consistent window that you give yourself the opportunity to have the sleep, then the body's hormonal systems will start to align with, again, the morning or sunlight, ideally, that you get. We have this cyclical rise of cortisol first thing in the morning, which is tied to our melatonin at nighttime. So if you can keep that cortisol peak high in the morning, you can have a higher melatonin spike late at night, which is then going to induce the deep sleep, alongside growth hormone and all of these other things like prolactin that do all of their jobs. So yeah, I think the body is very good at adapting. If generally you're starting to feel better through having more consistent sleep times, then I would stick with that. And the good thing about having a consistent sleep time and trying to avoid a morning alarm, if you can, is that your body's going to sleep for as long as it needs to. So it will either take more if you need more, or it will take less if you need less, and you can just get up and get on with your day, as opposed to being jolted awake and being all over the place for the first 10, 15 minutes of the day. You can kind of have this nice natural rise and get going. It seems scary not to have an alarm, but allow
No,
yourself a week
yeah,
and see what happens. You
good.
generally won't sleep in so much.
It's a good tip and feels like one that is actually like easy to do, because I think it's so much easier to go to sleep at a certain,
Hmm.
like it's just more fun to go to sleep than it is to wake up. So like to have a specific wake up time is a lot harder to kind of like emotionally deal with than to be like, oh, it's 10. I guess I have to go to bed now. Like I would rather go to bed than wake up. So that's a good
Yeah,
tip.
and again for me, I would have, so I'd fix a bedtime, and then I would have a ritual,
Mm.
either depending on how long you need, a half an hour, or 15 minutes, just to like, again, go through the motions of having a similar routine, which then primes your body for knowing it's time to sleep.
So it's the consistency over the protocol. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks for your time. This has been fascinating conversation. Do you want to give any shout outs to like where people can find you or kind of engage with your work?
Yeah, you can find me. So I work either one-to-one, so you can email me at ed@dredcaddye.com. My website is under construction at the moment, or you can find me on my educational school, which is school.com/Dr. Ed. And then if you're interested in something like the retreat, we are movementiahuasca.com, or my friend richardaceves.com. And we also coach coaches who are kind of fitness coaches or wanting to learn the way that we see the body, how all of the muscles have their own behavioral traits and cycles and behaviors and traumas associated with them very specifically, is moveacademy.com.
Okay,
And that's
amazing.
it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.